Episode 96, internationally renowned wildlife and nature photographer Frans Lanting. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Frans Lanting. Frans has been hailed as one of the great photographers of our time. For more than 3 decades, he's documented wildlife from the Amazon to Antarctica to promote understanding about the Earth and its natural history through images that convey a passion for nature and a sense of wonder about our living planet. He's received many honors, including Wildlife Photographer of the Year, the Lennart Nielsen Award, the Netherlands' highest conservation honor, the Royal Order of the Golden Ark, the Ansel Adams Award for Conservation Photography, and the Lifetime Achievement Award in Nature Photography. His latest book is titled Bay of Life, From Wind to Whales. Frans, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Fantastic to have you. So I think either this trip or maybe a trip before, were you in Antarctica or something, the most recent one?
Yes, I started a year in Antarctica, and since then I've been in southern Mexico to check up on the plight of monarch butterflies, which overwinter in the mountains of Mexico. And I've been crisscrossing Monterey Bay, where I'm quite actively covering, these extreme weather events we've experienced. The massive flooding in the Salinas and the Pajaro valleys, and the way the storm is beating down our coast. I was just out there this morning, and it just doesn't let up.
Yeah. We'll get into to that project a little bit later. But it got me to thinking, when you're at the point of the career that you're in, I mean, decades, in the making and all the accolades you've had, how do you decide where you want to go? What projects to take on? Like, are these generally commissioned by publications and organizations, or is this all on spec? Like, what drives your agenda?
More and more do we pick the projects that we want to pursue, because the media landscape has changed quite dramatically in the last 10 years. And the bandwidth within which I can express personal ideas or passions has just kind of become narrower and narrower. And I feel an urgency about the work that I do, because the natural world is in upheaval, and I feel what I can do is to make it relevant for people. And I don't want to wait for someone else to knock on my door and give me an assignment. So we tackle projects. Yeah. And I say we, because typically I do things together with my wife, who's also my creative partner in the business, Christine Ekstrom. So you'll hear me switch from first person to speaking in the plural.
Yeah, and you met her like on an expedition, right, several decades ago.
Christine Ekstrom was a staff writer at National Geographic when I first met her.
Okay.
And we were introduced by a mutual friend, and that was it. And we've been together ever since. This was 30 years ago. And her way of storytelling through writing really matched very well with my use of images as a way of visual storytelling. And we've acquired a lot of other skills, because in order to be successful independently, you have to wear a lot of hats. We're a small production company.
Yeah, you mentioned the media landscape, and I was curious what you think of the world of Instagram, where any Joe Schmo can pick up a camera, not even a good camera, their iPhone, their Android, and take a picture. And if it's, half decent and they're a good marketer, next thing you know, you got millions of followers for, quality that would have never made its way into National Geographic or any top tier publication. No, on the one hand, it's opened up the world and allowed, a hobby to flourish for a lot of people. But at the same time, does it frustrate you at all? Do you like it? Do you think the benefits outweigh the cons?
It's a fascinating phenomenon. It confirms the amazing power of photography as a way to share experiences and to do it instantly. And combined with the power of mobile phones, we've not seen anything like this since photography was invented
Hmm.
as a medium. When I became a photographer, some 40 years ago, it was a very specialized activity, and it was almost a bit, yeah, mystical. You had to go into dark rooms to develop film, and then there was the magic of seeing prints emerge from these trays, and it was very specialized knowledge, and there were not many photographers. Now anyone and everyone is a photographer, so the
Hmm.
barriers to entry have ceased to exist, and it's become a very noisy conversation. But it also means that the life cycle of every image is very short. The attention span of people has shortened
Hmm.
correspondingly, and it makes it very difficult for work that is developed over a longer period of time, that is more curated, often in collaboration with art directors or with editors. That whole traditional network through which photography and writing, for that matter as well, has been developed and shared with people in the era before Instagram. So it's a very different landscape. And we're active on Instagram and other social media platforms because they provide opportunities for direct communications, bypassing traditional media companies.
But
I
you've
also
also
think,
you've earned the right to have a lot of followers, right? Because you've got
yeah,
decades of being one of the top in the world in this field.
yeah,
But if I've got a big following out there and I want to start taking some pictures, I can all of a sudden, get all these people that are looking at substandard. So
yeah.
I didn't know if that was something you felt was a net positive to society, if that's the way to phrase it.
I feel a certain ambivalence about it, even though we're active, because
Yeah.
there's a breathlessness to this compulsion to publish every single day. And personally, I'd rather let experiences ripen to the point that I really have something to say that is worth sharing with people.
Hmm.
But that is not the media landscape that prevails these days.
Frans, you grew up in the Netherlands, right? Was
Correct.
photography a big hobby of yours growing up?
Not really. I always liked pictures, but I never thought that becoming a photographer was going to be an option. There were very few role models, especially in this niche of the natural world. I've
Hmm.
gravitated towards nature since I was a little kid. I was a bit of a loner. And being out there, I grew up in a small village near Rotterdam, a gritty port city.
Hmm.
And that was my world. And I didn't really think of photography as something that I could practice until I become a student at university in Rotterdam.
Yeah.
And
So
then,
so you were in a small village. Did you have a passion for animals?
yeah, but I gravitated towards the work of biologists. Conservation was not really a concept then
Hmm.
in the 1960s. But then I made a trip to the United States when I was a student in the early 70s. And that changed my life because there was a very different attitude towards photography in this niche of people who were focused on the natural world that took advantage of this new interest in connecting nature with what we were doing to the environment.
Didn't you come to the States? You were studying, you were an environmental economist, right?
Yes,
And then you somehow made the switch. But you made a switch when I don't think wildlife photography or nature photography was really much of a profession at the time.
it
So,
wasn't.
was there a plan of how you'd go about earning a living, or was it more just something you fell in love with and you're like, I'll just figure it out?
There was no business plan. But backing up
Yeah,
for a minute,
yeah.
in the United States, especially in the West Coast, I discovered that there was a movement, if you will,
Hmm.
between that combined artists, with activists, with scientists, with philanthropists, and politicians. And they really helped define the environmental movement on the West Coast. And there was a publisher named David Brower who
Hmm.
became director of the Sierra Club, later on founded Friends of the Earth, who invented the genre of coffee table books, combining high quality photography for a purpose. And he befriended Ansel Adams, Elliot Porter, and
Mm.
others, and enlisted them for a bigger cause. And that really appealed to me.
Hmm.
And I went back to the Netherlands, continued my studies, and I obtained a master's degree in environmental economics, which was a novelty at the time.
Hmm.
I became really interested in figuring out how you could combine the disciplines of ecology and economics to help quantify the value of nature for public decision making. And that's a mouthful, but in the
Hmm.
United States, under the Nixon administration, the National Environmental Policy Act had been enshrined, and that required environmental impact reports, and that triggered the development of methodologies. How do you frame the value of nature? In a positive sense, when it's still there, or in a negative sense, when we're doing things to it. And yeah, that was my academic interest. But then things change in my life, and by that time, I'd become very passionate about photography as a medium, and I decided to give it a try. In California, when people come here, they think they can become anything, right?
Hmm.
There was a courage here, there was a free thinking atmosphere. I ended up at UC Santa Cruz for my academic work, and
Hmm.
UC Santa Cruz was very free thinking. And that inspired me to say, okay, I'll give this a try. And miraculously, it worked.
Yeah, miraculously. Well, maybe more than miraculously, but timing is everything in this world.
Yeah.
I've learned nothing else. You mentioned Ansel Adams. Did you know him?
I met him just once
Yeah.
in a reserve close to where he lived, but I never spoke to him. But I've become very familiar with his work. I know quite a few people who worked with him. So he was a towering figure, not just because of the images that he created that have
Hmm.
been very sought after, but also his personal philosophy and his commitment to using his work or letting others use his work for activism.
Hmm. So he was someone, I assume, a role model of sorts.
Yeah, but I pursued a very different path because my platforms became the world of magazines, which flourished in the 1970s and the 1980s, and there were many of them here and many of them in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And I was lucky to enter this profession at a time when there was a keen interest in learning more about the world of nature
Hmm.
and also how we were affecting the world of nature through environmental issues that were getting a lot of interest.
So I read that since you didn't really grow up in photography per se, as a profession, it was relatively new. New
Yeah,
for you, new as a field in general. You didn't necessarily know a lot of the rules. So you ended up breaking a
exactly.
lot of them. So what kinds of rules were you breaking?
I think for people listening to this, especially for individuals thinking about a career in photography, or it doesn't really matter.
Hmm.
Um, and not knowing the rules will make you experiment with anything and everything. And when I think
Hmm.
back to how I got started and what kind of lessons I can pass along to others, it is maybe be aware of the rules, but then put them to the side and do things your own way and connect the dots outside the boundaries of your own profession.
Hmm. There was a TED talk you did. I must have watched it a half a dozen times.
Yeah,
But it was a story you told about meeting a tribal elder on an island near Vancouver. Jimmy Smith, I think, was the
yeah.
name. And he told you a story about animals all being the same on the inside. And it was a very important story for you to hear that impacted you. Can you share that one?
Yes, with attribution, because I'm keenly aware that these stories that have been nurtured by people on the coast of British Columbia they're proprietary. They're passed on from generation to generation,
Hmm.
and it can't just be anyone who tells those stories. They need to be appreciated within a certain context. So I spent a summer working with Haida and Quagule artists who were in the midst of a cultural renaissance. And I spent a lot of time with them out in the forest and in the villages, and ended up befriending a number of people who ordinarily wouldn't talk a lot with outsiders. And Jimmy Smith was very kind to share this story with me that centered around a cave on an island where his family and his people had lived for many, many generations. And it's one of these stories that aims to explain, the original connection between people and other animals, and that at some point, there was a rift, and we've been separate ever since. But that there are still connections, and you just have to look a little deeper and be a bit more observant and be a bit more quiet before you can reconnect in the same fundamental sense with other beings. That's my way to paraphrase the story.
Yeah, there's a part that you talk about, getting past the outer skin for us as humans to connect with animals, and it goes very deep. To appreciate everything we have in common with other living things. So if I'm hearing, there's a lot of, empathy toward the animals, empathy, toward nature. Was that always something that was part of you, back when you were a kid, or was that something that you developed over time?
I think it was always part of my attitude towards animals. I feel an empathy towards them, and then I cultivated that by absorbing, the work of the great ethologists like Conrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and others who were also aiming in their own work to demonstrate that animals were a lot more complex than people gave them credit for. There was an empathy embedded in ethology. And Nico and Conrad and others aimed to understand the whole animal instead of dissecting them the way a lab scientist would do.
Hmm.
And that really spoke to me. And I've built on that in my own work by giving animals time. And I borrow not just from the wisdom of scientists, but also the wisdom of people who come at it from a different perspective. Indigenous people who
Hmm.
have, thousands and thousands of years of accumulated practical experience and wisdom that often leads to other notions. And no matter whether it's Jimmy Smith or elders in the outback in Australia or in the deserts of southern Africa, those people have affirmed for me that there are many ways to appreciate that animals are much more complex beings than we give them credit for. But
Hmm.
now, interestingly, in more modern times, I think even traditional science is opening up to those notions.
Yeah. So then, how do you go about trying to convey visually, what you obviously must feel in your heart?
Yeah, that's to pay respect is something that I aim for, and I try to do that by creating images that lure people into the complexities with a visual outer layer that is alluring. And pictures have this amazing ability to penetrate people's minds and then their hearts because it's all eye candy on the outside, right? It's colors, it's patterns. And if you combine that with a compelling subject, then you've got a recipe for reaching people.
Hmm.
But to take it the next step
Hmm.
of portraying animals in a way that confirms that they're more complex, that a bear is not a bear is not a bear. I often do that by spending a lot of time with small groups of animals, and then gradually individuality emerges, and that is a key to my philosophy. that every animal is an individual in the same way as we are individuals. And the great portrait photographers, they know how to do that, how to turn someone from being a reluctant subject who walks into a studio into someone who actually enjoys collaborating with the photographer, and you end up with a portrait that is memorable.
You get the bear to cooperate? Is that what you're saying?
I knew you would ask that as a follow up. So, no, I can't do that. I have to use time and humility and understanding as gateways into these other realities. And
Hmm.
it doesn't always work. But the more I know and the more I open myself, the easier it becomes. And then I can come up with these intersections. And there are always magic moments when I'm able to capture something that reveals more than what that moment represents.
Hmm. Well, on that, I read that, beyond capturing the beauty of these animals, you like to try to capture their strength and dignity. So I can sort of visualize how one might try to convey strength of an animal, but I was curious about capturing dignity. How does that happen? What are you trying to do there?
It's an attitude. It can be a simple gesture. It can be an interaction between different individuals. It can be by connecting an individual animal with its environment. There are a number of different ways in which that can happen, or it can be done by adding context through writing and through other media.
One of the things I think stylistically that you're known for is shooting these animals at eye level.
Yeah.
What's behind that? Did you stumble upon that, or are you trying to capture something that others aren't doing by having that technique?
Yeah, when I started practicing that deliberately, the prevailing concepts within wildlife photography were a bit more static.
Hmm.
It was a domain of people who like to aim long lenses at reluctant subjects, and I try to get past that by spending more time looking for situations where it make them feel more comfortable with my presence. Because the closer you can be, the more intimate things become, and cultivating a style that involved being eye to eye was a very direct method. And small animals were often photographed from 5 feet up. It's kind of an anthropomorphic approach to connecting with animals, right? And in Africa, the prevailing methodology was to sit in a Land Rover, and I try to get out of the Land Rovers, opening myself up, which is a little bit scary. You don't do that when you have a 1 week period somewhere. But I've experimented with a lot of different ways to break through those barriers physically. And it
Yeah.
doesn't always work, but I think it's produced enough memorable images that I know that you can get closer in a metaphorical sense.
So when you get out of that Land Rover, any close encounters?
Yeah, there was, I remember spending a lot of time at one particular waterhole. You can race around and look for opportunity after opportunity when you're in Africa, which is one approach. And I chose for the opposite approach. I had the luxury of time, so I said, okay, what can I do that is different? And so I chose one water hole, and I let animals come to that water hole, and I would end up at the edge of the water hole with an assistant sitting in a Land Rover to watch out for potential danger. And one morning I was out there lying flat on the ground, and I heard this lapping sound next to me, and I looked to my right, and there was a pride of lionesses about 40 feet away, and they were clearly thirstier than they were hungry. And then I carefully looked behind me, and there was my assistant snoring in the Jeep. So, and at that
Right.
point, you
Your
can't
lookout.
you can't get up because the last thing you want to do is trigger that instinct by big cats to give chase. So I
Hmm.
just had to wait it out and pretend it was all normal.
How about when you're, I mean, you're in the jungles and everything. Have you had like malaria? Have there been diseases that you've gotten as a result?
Yeah, more than I like to remember, but it was all part and parcel of doing the field work in difficult places like the Congo and Madagascar. And if you want to get out on the ground on level terms with animals, or if you want to be out there with people, you have to expose yourself. And when you're working in the Congo, you can't retreat to a hotel at the end of the day.
Yeah. So give me a sense as to what goes into taking the right shot in terms of, I assume like you're not at that water hole for 20 or 30 minutes. I mean, are you often having to sit still for hours upon hours, even sometimes days,
Yeah.
to get yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, in the case of that waterhole, I made a conscious decision that this is a place where interesting things could happen if I would just give it time. The key to getting into the lives of animals is to understand the places where they like to be and to anticipate when they're going to be there, and then also to anticipate behavior, interactions, etc., and ultimately to make yourself part of that equation instead of being an observer from a long distance. So by just going back to the same spot time and again, every morning, every afternoon, I learned a lot about the behavior of animals, but also about visual opportunities. And then ultimately, there are always these moments, I call them moments of serendipity, where everything comes together. And some people might say, well, it's luck. But I like to think that it is a process of understanding situations, and when something happens, I'm prepared. I know, okay, this creature does that, and there's a fair chance that the next thing that's going to happen is this, and then I need to be prepared with a camera. And of course, these days, cameras are so much more prepared than they used to be.
Yeah.
But it's a long process. It's opening yourself up and making commitments and trust that ultimately the results will come. But to bring it back to what we started to talk about these
Mm-hmm.
days, we live in a world where everything is speeded up. That process of giving yourself time is become much rarer in every phase of life, not just when it comes to you're working with animals, it is you're working with people. Everything has to become so fast these days and yield results instantly.
So when you're trying to get this shot, there's something you've said before, which is there's an interaction that goes on between you and the animals. And you're not just sitting there, with a telephoto lens trying to get the right shot. But I'm trying to understand. I get the part about you're observing and taking in information and studying and understanding. What's the interaction part? Or do you feel that there's a role that the animal is playing on the other end?
Yeah, it's that I don't want to create the impression that there's some kind of mystical interaction that somehow I'm able to pierce through the natural reluctance of animals to accept human beings close by. That's not the case. It typically is a one-way street.
Mm-hmm.
But by learning a lot from people or from science, and by opening myself up, I can define the parameters within which interesting things can happen.
Hmm.
And for the rest, it's up to them or to the vagaries of light and other circumstances. But sooner or later, things always happen.
Yeah.
I believe in that.
Yeah. Is there an interplay with light? Or some animals better visualize during evening light or morning light, or does it not really matter? Does that come into play here at all?
Yeah, it all depends. Light is
Yeah.
a magic ingredient.
Hmm.
Photography is writing with light. So if I can bottle up certain kinds of light and let them out to stroke the subjects when I need them, that would be fantastic. But it is one of these unpredictable things. But
Hmm.
having said that, I can influence that as well, because the more aware you are of what certain kinds of light do and where you need to be relative to where the light is coming from, you can increase the odds. And now I'm beginning to talk like a photography teacher. I love to teach photography to people
Yeah,
who
please.
think that.
I'm learning. I'm taking notes.
I've learned over the years that people who are entering into photography, whether it is amateurs or as aspiring professionals, have a preoccupation with the technology. And I have a deceptively simple approach. And yet, I think the technicalities take care of themselves after you determine for yourself what it is you're interested in and what your connection is with the subject in front of you. And I cultivate this mental dialogue with myself, and I teach that to others as well, is yep, create clarity. Try to describe what you're interested in one sentence or turn it into a haiku for that matter. Crystallize this into something that is just one idea. Most people think that, yes, this is interesting, that is interesting, that is interesting, and you end up with add-ons. But that doesn't turn into a good photograph necessarily. In the same way as when you are involved with writing, you also have to come up with a story idea, you have to define characters, and then you have to start sculpting away at what doesn't matter anymore. Painters build up from nothing to something. And in photography, you go in the other direction because the world is full of stuff. It's full of complexity and also full of contradictions in a visual sense. And my style is to delete as much as possible until there is clarity.
I imagine a lot of first timers are there's multiple layers of this, right? That the
Yeah.
surface layer is, oh, there's a beautiful mountain, a beautiful tree, a beautiful animal. I just want to capture it. But then there's going that next layer or two that you go, which is trying to capture personality, trying to capture the essence of the animal, back to its dignity or its grace or what have you, which goes
Yeah.
into more than just, flickering the shutter a bunch of times. It goes to really studying and understanding and seeing what you're trying to convey, which
Yeah.
it clearly comes across. I noticed something, some of your images have this, and it won't make sense till people go and look at your photographs, but this almost surreal quality to them that in a way can make them hard to distinguish between a photograph and a painting, if that makes sense. I absolutely am mesmerized by them. They're beautiful. And so I was trying to get a feel for, is that playing with light in its natural sense? Is that the use of certain filters to do visual effects afterwards? How do you, are you trying to convey that?
I think I know what you're referring to. I think it goes back to an earlier interest in painting traditions, yeah, the surrealist and writing traditions that were quite well developed in Western Europe, the magic realists, and yeah, that characterization may not make much sense to people here
Mhm.
in this country, but that influenced my outlook on the world, and it led me to be aware of opportunities where you can capture images that have different layers that make people think twice. Is this really the way it is, or is there something else going on?
Right.
And through the use of certain lenses, I can distort perspectives, whether it is a wide angle lens that enables me to create more depth, or whether it is a telephoto lens that compresses perspective, which is something that artists in Asia have practiced for many centuries. I can use the technology to drive images to certain effect, and then the magic ingredient of light can turn an ordinary situation into something extraordinary. And I use light. I started experimenting early on with bringing strobes, flash units into the natural environment, which was a novelty when I started practicing it. And it enabled me to make ordinary things look extraordinary.
Hmm.
And it also enabled me to work longer hours early in the morning and late in the evening. So those are all tools of the trade.
Hmm.
So it goes together. I want people to think and to spend more than a couple of seconds with an image. And whatever
Hmm.
I can do to achieve that, I'll do it, whether it's through stringing images together, because I believe that that's another way that makes me a more effective communicator. A single image perfectly executed is wonderful, but I like to start with a concept and then string images together and it becomes a visual language. And I've done that, through my assignment work for National Geographic. How do you distill the essence of a place or an animal into 10 images? That's like writing a haiku. And in longer form, I've practiced that with books and then this life project, which was an attempt to use photography as a way to take people on an imaginary journey from the Big Bang to the present, which is a challenge. How do you invoke what the world looked like 2, 3 billion years ago and make it look real? So I use photography in a
Hmm.
number of different ways. I ceased to think of myself as a quote wildlife photographer many years ago.
Hmm.
I'm a photographer who explores the world, and I really use it as a medium to help myself understand what's going on and then share the experiences with other people at a time when it's become really relevant and, in fact, very urgent that we evaluate that fractured relationship. And pictures are great currency to start conversations with.
Yeah. What you've been at this for 30 plus years now?
Yeah, more than that.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've gone through a number of evolutions.
Yeah.
One you sort of, I think, alluded to here was you maybe moved away earlier in your career from capturing, let's say, a single species
Hmm.
to capturing the essence of nature as a network of relationships amongst many species. I'd love to hear about that one and any other evolutions you've had where, like, if I look at a Frans photo today, how dramatically different it might look from one that would have been taken decades past.
Yeah, my personal evolution mirrors the way people in science and conservation have evolved their notions about the world of nature, the natural world that we're surrounded by. And when the World Wildlife Fund was founded in 1961, there was a preoccupation with rhinos. And WWF was founded to deal with the slaughter of rhinos. And I became intensely involved in helping elevate the profile of individual animals to make them look more dignified, as we discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that with species like bonobos, which are very closely related to us. But as I became more involved with conservation efforts through WWF and many other organizations, I realized that I could be more effective in that role by portraying them as ambassadors for ecosystems. And that same growth is something that all these organizations have gone through. Yeah, we can save species, but unless there's habitats, protected habitats, they're not going to survive. And then in the 1970s, this new idea began to take shape that led to the term biodiversity in the 1990s. And that notion evolved almost simultaneously in the brains of Professor E.O. Wilson and Thomas Lovejoy. And it came out of the term biological diversity, and then it was simplified. And biodiversity was meant to recognize that nature's a network of relationships as opposed to individual species. And that's a safety net for us, a safety net for a living planet. And that concept forced me to think very differently of nature. You can't visualize it anymore by showing a magnificent elephant, you have to
Hmm.
look for the relationships. And I did a year-long project for National Geographic, searching for new concepts to visualize biodiversity. And that was quite a challenge. And in the process, I ended up working with E.O. Wilson. And I ended up photographing him at Walden Pond, where Thoreau
Hmm.
sat and thought about the meaning of nature when it was a very different reality. So it's a search for how can we define nature in terms that make it relevant. And biodiversity is now superseded by new terms. I try to wrap it around this concept of the unity of life with the Life Project. Genetic science has confirmed that we're all related, right? And this much touted connection between us and chimps and bonobos. We share 98% of our genes. I think isn't nearly as profound as the fact that we share 50% of our genes with a crop of lettuce. That is a fundamental relationship.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Maybe more empathy for the bonobos than
Yes.
the lettuce. I guess what I'm wondering is now that it's sort of maybe evolved to a means to an end, which is
Yeah.
leverage for conservation efforts. Do you feel it's working? Our empathy toward animals or toward nature, wildlife, ecosystems, do you feel it's helping?
I think we're making progress on some fronts, and but just as conservation was becoming more professionalized, and we were, as you can see, I speak in the plural because I consider myself a member of that community.
Hmm.
Then the new realities of global upheaval through the effects of climate change kind of forced us to rethink everything. And on top of that came new concepts of social inclusion and recognition that no, nature isn't spread equally around the globe. Some people benefit a lot more from nature than other communities do. So I think it's an ongoing debate, and it will not be done because we are impacting the planet at an accelerating fashion. And I think the big question is, can we learn fast enough from our mistakes to achieve a better balance? I don't have the answer to that.
I think as a species, humans tend to sometimes maybe fall short in terms of actions that we need to do today
Yeah.
that we may not see the benefits of, but our children and our children's children and
Yeah.
generations from now will. It seems to be there's a tough time. I hate to even call it sacrifices, because even that puts a negative spin on it. But taking the actions we need to preserve and protect our forests, our trees, our biodiversity.
Yeah.
You've been all over the world, of course. And this latest project, the book is called Bay of Life. You didn't have to go very far. You sort of opened your door and walked outside, and you're in the Monterey Bay Area.
Right.
Stunning book as usual. No surprise there. Why did you choose this as your subject?
I've lived at the shores of Monterey Bay in the town of Santa Cruz for more than 30 years. And I appreciate it both as an insider because I've been here for a long time, but also as an outsider because I'm a global traveler. And every time I come back, I realize that this place is very special, but that there's a deep story of interactions between people and nature that makes it even more interesting. Indigenous people have been here for 10,000 years, and it was a place of abundance to them. And then in 1770, when the first Spanish colonizers arrived, those connections were brutally severed. And then came an era of intense exploitation for 100 years, and one resource after the other was stripped. The whales, the redwoods, the abalone, everything disappeared in a matter
Mm-hmm.
of decades. And then miraculously, the ecosystem has been healed bit by bit. And the stripping of natural resources in a period of a few decades is something that I've witnessed everywhere. It's happening as we speak in the Amazon, in Borneo,
Mm-hmm.
parts of
Mm-hmm.
Africa. But that healing, that is more unusual. Because typically, when we strip away natural resources, things settle in at a much lower level of natural abundance. Monterey Bay's got unique characteristics. Its system's very dynamic, onshore and offshore. But also, people really became very active here and said, no, we can turn this around. And I've been aware of the activism here for many years, and I've long wanted to pay tribute to that. And that's what Bay of Life is all about, to pay tribute to this amazing place and also to the fact that, yes, we can destroy an ecosystem, but we can also bring it back. And I think that's a very relevant story for our time because we're surrounded by doom and gloom. And I think it's really important that we empower ourselves to say, yes, we can do this. And it may take more time, but we have to do it because otherwise we all end up passing on this living planet in a diminished state. So we did Bay of Life in a different way than we've done many of our previous projects. And I'm speaking in the plural here because Christine and I created this together. Instead of doing this in partnership with a big media company, we wanted to do this with and for people who live and work in the region. So a very different starting point. So we cultivated connections with local partners, and we wanted to tell stories in a way that is relevant for people here. It's been very interesting to hear that confirmed. A number of people, when they open the book and they go through it, they said, this is like a family album of the place we all love. And that's exactly what we wanted to do, local pride.
Although, it's interesting, Frans, I lived out in the Bay Area for a couple of
Yeah,
years after business school. I used to go down to Monterey and Carmel and that whole area
yeah,
several times a year. And it's a beautiful family album to that point, but with a whole number of family members I never knew existed because I learned a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, you're right.
Looking at that
Yeah,
book, I'm like, I didn't know species
yes,
existed that you captured. And even just,
yeah.
I went down there because of nature, but you captured that in a way I think I'd never seen before. So I was able to see a little bit of this through your lens, which is really beautiful. I mean, there's a lot you knew about the region that you were trying to convey to others. Was there anything that you didn't know that you learned through the course of this project?
Well, I'll try and give you two vignettes, and then I really encourage people to get a copy of the book and look for themselves and read the stories. We live out in the country, and we have a little pond right by the kitchen, and we have a lot of little tree frogs there. But one night, an endangered species of frog known as the red-legged frog moved in. He found the pond and decided that this is a place where he wanted to be. And now, a couple of years later, we have nurtured a second generation of red-legged frogs. That just confirms that the stories are never done and that nature explores. And so that was phenomenal. And we still hear him every night. And we know he's different
They're probably
from,
loud, aren't they?
well, this guy's a little quiet,
Okay.
but he's different from the red-legged frog we had a couple of years ago. He sounds different. Animals are individuals, right?
hmm Yeah. What was the other vignette?
The other vignette was after we had this massive fire here a couple of years ago, the CZU fire that nearly burned our own home as well. It was a traumatic experience for the whole region. Many people lost their homes. And the big basin, which is protected as a state park, burned almost completely. And a year after the fire, we were tipped off that a very rare species of seabird that nests in big redwoods and dog firs had been discovered with a nest in a burned tree. And we sat there for a couple of evenings waiting for a chick to fledge, surrounded by trees that had been charred and given up for life. And then one evening, this little seabird just leapt out of the nest and through the dark miraculously found its way to the ocean without anyone telling it how to fly and where to go.
Wow. I love both of those. When you've had the kind of success you've had in this field, the Wildlife Photographer of the Year and the Lifetime Achievement Awards and on and on and on, clearly there's a passion there. there's clearly an empathy. There's a lot of technique. I'm sure we barely scraped the surface here, but there are probably thousands upon thousands of photographers out there, spending all day trying to get the right shoot and pouring their passion into this and learning techniques and what have you. And they're just not, at the Frans level. So when you look back, what do you think it is that allowed you to get to that level over the years? Are there one or two themes that you feel enabled you to reach the top of that field?
That's an interesting question. When I was in Mexico recently to document monarch butterflies again, I ran into a friend who's a great photographer who was there to photograph monarchs for National Geographic. And we went through one of my books and he says, yeah, I know that image, I know that image, I know that image. Some of these photographs have become icons that have and continue to inspire other people. And that's very gratifying. Photography is a complex activity because you have to juggle a lot of components and you need to develop a muscle memory so that you don't have to be too preoccupied with the camera itself. So you need to be focused on the subject and the context of the subject. But I think without a natural affinity for the medium that you're working in, you can practice and practice and practice, but some people distinguish themselves more than others. And it's the same in music, in writing, in any other field. I think similar principles are at play. So I think passion and persistence are really important. And I see that in people who come to me who say, I want to do this, I want to do that. And it becomes clear pretty quickly who has the passion and the persistence in addition to the technical ability who'll reach new ground. And I'm really grateful for having nurtured some of those careers.
This podcast you're on is called The Art of Excellence. And I always like to turn the mic over to my guests and help them define for me what they think of that word excellence. And you can take it any which way you want, but what comes to mind when you think of it?
Excellence can be defined as, when it comes to photography, as perfection within a frame. When everything works, when you can separate, one subset of the visual reality from the context, so that people accept it as something that only lives within the boundaries of that frame. And I think a lot of the craft and the art of photography has been focused on that. I believe in the power of photography as a visual language, and then you have to go outside the frame because you have to connect the dots for people, through multiple images or other media, because otherwise it's an internally focused reality that is self-referential. And I believe in making imagery part of conversations. And I think a next benchmark would be to the extent that the work inspires and sustains conversations, because then you achieve a certain relevance and it's not just an image that hangs on people's walls. And at least that's what I strive for. But ultimately, it's up to other people to define that, I guess. Yeah. I keep moving. I'm a work in progress.
I don't think you're anywhere near done from what I can tell.
Yeah.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. I mean, honestly, these are coffee table books that will never leave the coffee table because they're beautiful. But more than just what this is doing, hopefully, I'd like to be hopeful, to broader conservation efforts. Anything that can help us do the right thing to preserve our natural habitat, I hope we figure out sooner than later, thanks to people like you. So thank you for taking the time with me.
Thank you. Maybe we'll have another conversation.
I would
offline or online.
I would love it. I'd love both of them. Hey everyone. Okay, please don't go away just yet. A couple favors to ask. Favor number one, and I know I've asked before, but if you haven't had a chance to leave a review and you enjoy the show, it would honestly mean a lot if you could go to iTunes and write a review. that goes a long way. So thank you for that. Also, had a chance to deliver a keynote based on a lot of the learnings I've had from this show. Really enjoyed it. So if you are in any way affiliated with any organization, for-profit, non-for-profit, doesn't really matter, but there's some event where you think they might be looking for a keynote, I appreciate if you would keep me in mind for that. I can be reached at glenn@theartofexcellence.com. Thank you all for listening. We are inching closer to episode 100. Super excited for that sometime later this year. In the meantime, keep being excellent. Tune in next time. Thanks, everybody.